Imagine, if you will, a moment frozen in time within the hallowed halls of academia, a silence so profound it seemed to absorb the very air, a tension so dense it could be cut with a knife. Oxford University, with its venerable 800-year history, had never before borne witness to such an absolute stillness, a collective holding of breath by 500 academics, students, and world leaders. This was not the hushed reverence of a library or the anticipatory quiet before a grand symphony. This was the silence of shock, of outrage, and of a dawning realization that the carefully constructed edifice of accepted wisdom was about to face an unprecedented challenge. The man who had just orchestrated this extraordinary quiet, Professor Edmund Harrington, stood upon the venerable stage of the Sheldon Inn Theater, his declaration still echoing in the vaulted ceilings: "Africa has contributed nothing to human civilization." It was a statement delivered with an almost arrogant certainty, a conclusion he clearly believed to be beyond dispute. Yet, unbeknownst to him, a single calm figure in the front row had just begun a series of deliberate movements that would unravel his career and ignite a global conversation. Before we delve into this pivotal moment, if you find yourself intrigued by the power of truth and the dismantling of long-held prejudices, we invite you to become part of this journey. Please take a moment to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps ensure these crucial stories of historical reevaluation reach a wider audience, fostering a deeper understanding of our shared human legacy. That March afternoon, the Sheldon Inn Theater was packed, its historic architecture usually serving as a backdrop for lectures on subjects of global import. Today was meant to be a routine discourse on global leadership in the 21st century, a prestigious event featuring various world leaders and academics. Among the distinguished guests sat Ibrahim Traore, the then president of Burkina Faso, a man whose presence in the university's African Leadership Series was both a recognition of his emerging influence and perhaps a token gesture in the eyes of some. He sat quietly in the front row, dressed in a simple, dark suit, diligently taking notes as various speakers presented their views on development, democracy, and international cooperation. His unassuming demeanor belied the quiet strength that would soon be unleashed. At precisely 3:30 p.m., Professor Edmund Harrington took the stage. A man in his late 60s with distinguished silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he commanded a respect forged over decades of prolific published work on European history and civilization. His introduction was glowing, a litany of academic achievements. Rhodes Scholar, author of 12 books, holder of 3 honorary doctorates. As he began his lecture on the foundations of modern civilization, his tone was confidently authoritative, almost dismissive, as if the conclusions he was about to present were, indeed, beyond any form of dispute. "When we examine the pillars of human advancement," Harrington began, his voice resonating through the historic venue, "we see a clear pattern. Mathematics from Greece, law from Rome, philosophy from Germany, industrial innovation from Britain." He paused, surveying the audience over his wire-rimmed glasses, a settled challenge in his gaze. "The foundations of what we call civilization have decidedly Western origins." Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Harrington continued, seemingly emboldened by the academic setting that had long protected such unchallenged views. 20 minutes into his lecture, Harrington made the statement that would irrevocably define the rest of his life. Now, some might ask about other continents' contributions, he mused, a hint of patronizing magnanimity in his voice. Asia gave us gunpowder and paper, certainly. The Americas had sophisticated calendars. But Africa, he paused dramatically, a slight smirk on his lips, an almost theatrical flourish. "I challenge anyone in this room to name a single significant contribution to human civilization from sub-Saharan Africa. The continent has been a recipient of civilization, not a contributor to it." The silence that followed was not merely deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that fell over the entire theater. In the front row, Ibrahim Traore slowly closed his notebook. He placed his pen carefully on the desk beside it, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Around him, several African students and academics sat frozen, caught between the burgeoning outrage and the intimidating atmosphere of challenging such a senior, well-established professor in Oxford's most prestigious venue. The moment stretched on, thick with unspoken tension, until, with a quiet certainty that belied the monumental impact it would have, Ibrahim Traore raised his hand. The tension was a living thing, a palpable weight in the Sheldonian theater as Ibrahim Traore's hand rose into the air. Professor Harrington, clearly not expecting to be challenged, much less by a head of state from the very continent he had just disparaged, acknowledged him with barely concealed irritation. Yes, he conceded, a sharp, clipped sound that suggested impatience rather than invitation. Traore stood, his movements deliberate and calm, a stark contrast to the agitated hum that had begun to ripple through the audience. "Professor Harrington," he began, his voice carrying clearly despite not using the microphone, a natural authority in his tone that commanded attention. "I would like to respond to your assertion, if I may." Harrington's smirk, which had momentarily vanished in surprise, widened again. "By all means, Mr. he began, feigning ignorance of Traore's identity, a petty and transparent act given that the president had been formally introduced at the event's outset. "Traore, Ibrahim Traore," he replied simply, omitting his title, allowing his name to stand unadorned, yet resonant with an unspoken weight. "And I accept your challenge." A ripple of anticipation, almost a collective gasp, ran through the audience. Heads craned, and within seconds, several people began discreetly raising their phones, sensing that something significant, something truly unprecedented, was about to unfold. Harrington, still underestimating the man before him, merely gestured dismissively toward the podium. "Please, enlighten us, but do try to stick to historical facts rather than romantic nationalism." The condescension in his voice was thick, almost tangible, designed to belittle and disarm. Traore walked to the podium with measured, unhurried steps. He carried with him a simple leather folder, which he placed carefully on the lectern, its understated presence a counterpoint to the professor's grand pronouncements. For a moment he stood silently, his gaze sweeping across the audience, then settling directly on Harrington. "Professor," he began, his voice still calm, yet now imbued with an undeniable gravitas, "before I address your challenge, may I ask you a question?" Harrington, trapped by his earlier concession, nodded curtly. "In your extensive research, have you ever visited the manuscript collections in Timbuktu? Have you studied the mathematical treatises of the Dogon people? Have you examined the metallurgical techniques of the Haya people of Tanzania?" Harrington waved a hand dismissively, his face a mask of patronizing disdain. "Ancient mud buildings and primitive folklore hardly constitute civilization, Mr. Traore. We're talking about contributions to human advancement, not anthropological curiosities." Several gasps could be heard from the audience at the blatant disrespect, a clear breach of academic decorum. But Traore remained imperturbable. He simply opened his folder and pulled out a single, unassuming document. "Then let us begin with something you might recognize," he said, holding up a photocopy of an ancient text. "This is a page from the Lubombo bone, discovered in Swaziland. It's 44,000 years old, Professor. It contains the earliest known mathematical calculations in human history. 29 distinct notches, meticulously marking lunar cycles. Mathematics didn't begin in Greece, Professor. It began in Africa." The smirk that had been fixed on Harrington's face began, almost imperceptibly, to fade. But he quickly recovered, attempting to regain control. "Counting notches is hardly Pythagoras," he scoffed, his tone still dismissive, though now laced with a hint of unease. Traore, however, was prepared. He pulled out another document. Then perhaps we should discuss the Ishango bone from the Democratic Republic of Congo, 20,000 years old, containing clear evidence of prime numbers, multiplication, and division. This predates Greek mathematics by nearly 19,000 years. He paused, letting the staggering numbers sink in, allowing the profound weight of that temporal chasm to settle over the room. The initial murmurs from the audience had died down entirely. The collective breathing was shallow. Everyone was now completely silent, hanging on every word, as Ibrahim Traore, with quiet certainty, began to rewrite history before their very eyes.
"But you want more recent examples?" Traore continued, his voice gaining a quiet, formidable strength, yet never losing its calm dignity. The question hung in the charged air, a polite challenge that resonated with an undeniable power. "Very well, let's discuss the University of Senghor in Timbuktu. In the 12th century, Professor, when Oxford was still little more than a collection of drinking halls and nascent academic aspirations, Senghor housed over 700,000 manuscripts. It educated 25,000 students across a diverse curriculum, including astronomy, medicine, law, and mathematics. Does that not constitute a significant contribution to human civilization's intellectual advancement?" The audience was now completely silent, captivated, their previous discomfort replaced by a profound curiosity, hanging on every word. "You mentioned law coming from Rome?" Traore pressed on, his gaze still fixed on Harrington, whose earlier smirk had now been entirely replaced by a look of strained focus. "Shall we discuss the constitution of the Ashanti Confederacy, which included checks and balances, a system of separation of powers, 3 centuries before the American Constitution? Or the Buganda Parliament, which boasted a complex system of democratic governance and representative rule, while much of Europe was still ruled by absolute monarchs, far from the ideals of participatory government?" He moved seamlessly, dismantling Harrington's Eurocentric framework piece by piece. "You speak of philosophy from Germany? Have you read the philosophical texts of Zara Yacob, the 17th century Ethiopian philosopher who developed profound ideas about rational inquiry, ethical living, and human rights that demonstrably preceded the European Enlightenment? His student Walda Huvat wrote treatises on ethics that rival anything produced in Europe at the time. But of course," Traore added, a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor of irony entering his voice, "they wrote in gaze, not Latin, so perhaps they don't count in your estimation." Harrington tried to interject, a stammering attempt to dismiss the examples. "These are isolated examples." But Traore for the first time held up his hand, and surprisingly the senior professor fell silent, his authority visibly faltering. "Isolated, Professor?" Traore's voice rose slightly, a controlled crescendo of indignation. "Let me tell you about isolation. It's when the Library of Alexandria, founded by an African dynasty, housed the world's collective knowledge, while the ancestors of Oxford's founders were still living in rudimentary mud huts. It's when African mathematicians were accurately calculating the circumference of the Earth, while Europeans widely believed it was flat. That, Professor, is isolation of knowledge. You want contributions to civilization?" Traore's voice was now sharp, precise, cutting through the last vestiges of Harrington's composure. "Let's talk about medicine. The first successful cataract surgery was performed in Mali in the 14th century, a delicate procedure requiring immense skill. The first recorded cesarean section, where both mother and child survived, was performed in Uganda in 1879, using techniques of antisepsis and anesthesia that wouldn't appear in European medicine for another 50 years. The first vaccination, not Edward Jenner's cowpox, but variolation against smallpox, was practiced in West Africa and brought to America by enslaved Africans, a life-saving innovation that predates many Western medical milestones." He pulled out another paper, a subtle rustle filling the profound silence. "Architecture. The Great Zimbabwe's acoustic properties surpass modern engineering. a testament to sophisticated architectural understanding. The Nubian pyramids predate their more famous Egyptian counterparts, showcasing an earlier mastery of monumental construction. The rock churches of Lalibela were carved from single pieces of volcanic rock with a precision that modern engineers still struggle to explain. But perhaps you've never heard of these, Professor, because they don't fit your narrative of African primitiveness. The transformation in the room was palpable. Students who had been slouching were now sitting upright, many frantically taking notes, their faces a mixture of awe and dawning anger. Several professors were nodding along, some looking uncomfortable as their own knowledge gaps were exposed, others seemingly discovering this information for the very first time. Harrington's face had gone from dismissive to defensive and now to something approaching raw panic. "Let's discuss metallurgy," Traore continued, his voice now carrying the unshakable authority of absolute certainty. The Haya people of Tanzania were producing carbon steel in blast furnaces 2,000 years ago, a technique that wouldn't appear in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. The bronzes of Benin are so sophisticated, so exquisitely crafted, that when Europeans first saw them, they refused to believe Africans could have made them, inventing ludicrous theories about lost Portuguese craftsmen. And agriculture? Africans domesticated pearl millet, sorghum, African rice, yam, black-eyed peas, watermelon, and okra, staples that feed billions today. They developed complex irrigation systems in the Sahel that sustained cities of hundreds of thousands while Europe was experiencing the Dark Ages. The terraced agriculture of the Dogon people has sustained communities for over 1,000 years in conditions where European farming methods would fail within a season. Traore paused, looking directly at Harrington, who was now visibly sweating despite the cool temperature of the theater. But perhaps most importantly, Professor, let's talk about Ubuntu, the profound philosophical concept that I am because we are. While European philosophy was obsessing over individual rights and conquest, African philosophy was developing concepts of restorative justice, collective responsibility, and human dignity that the so-called civilized world is only now beginning to understand. "The tragedy, Professor Harrington," Traore said, his voice now soft but piercing, "is not that Africa contributed nothing to civilization. The tragedy is that scholars like you have spent centuries actively erasing, ignoring, and denigrating those contributions. When the Library of Timbuktu was at its height, housing more books than any European university, your ancestors called us illiterate. When our astronomers were tracking the movements of the stars, you called us superstitious. When our healers were performing complex surgeries, you called us witch doctors." He picked up his folder again, pulling out one final, damning document. "This, Professor," he declared, holding up a faded photocopy, "is a letter from Cecil Rhodes, founder of the very scholarship that perhaps funded your education. In it, he explicitly states that African history must be suppressed to justify colonization. Your ignorance isn't accidental, Professor. It's the result of a deliberate, systematic effort to erase African contributions to human civilization's intellectual advancement." The silence in the theater that followed was not just absolute, it was a stunned, damning testament to a truth finally unveiled.
The silence that fell over the Sheldonian theater, heavy with the weight of unearthed truths, was absolute. Harrington stood at the side of the stage, his mouth opening and closing, a fish out of water, but no words emerged. His academic armor, built over decades, had been shattered. Traore, however, wasn't quite finished. His voice, still quiet, carried across the stunned room. "I could continue for hours, Professor," he stated, a subtle implication of vast, untapped knowledge. "I could tell you about the astronomical calculations of the Dogon people, who knew about Sirius B centuries before Western telescopes could detect it. I could describe the complex fractal geometry in African art that predates Mandelbrot by centuries. I could explain how the call and response tradition of African music became the very foundation for jazz, blues, rock, and virtually every form of popular music you hear today. But I think I've made my point." Traore concluded, his gaze once more locking with Harrington's. The question isn't whether Africa contributed to civilization. The question is why you, a professor at one of the world's most prestigious universities, don't know any of this. Or worse, he paused, letting the implication hang, why you know it and choose to deny it. Then it began. The first clap came from a young African woman in the third row, a single, defiant sound. Another followed, then another, a growing wave of affirmation. Within seconds, the entire theater erupted in thunderous applause. Students rose to their feet, then professors, then even some of the staid administrators, a collective acknowledgement of a paradigm shift. But the most remarkable reaction came from an elderly white professor in the front row, Professor Mary Whitfield, head of African Studies. She stood, grasped her microphone, and her voice, trembling slightly with emotion, resonated through the venue. "Mr. President," she said, acknowledging Traore's actual title for the first time, a small but significant gesture of respect. "As a member of this institution, I apologize. Your words today have exposed a shameful blind spot in our curriculum. I move that Oxford immediately review and revise our history programs to include the African contributions you've outlined." The applause renewed, even louder, echoing the collective desire for change. Harrington, isolated on the side of the stage, looked around desperately for support, but found none. His decades of authority had evaporated in 10 minutes. When the thunderous applause finally died down, Traore spoke once more, his voice quiet yet resonant with the weight of the moment. "I don't seek apologies," he said. "I seek truth. And the truth is that human civilization is not the property of any one continent or race. It's the culmination of all human achievement, from the first mathematical calculation on an African bone to the latest scientific discovery. But as long as professors like Dr. Harrington continue to teach a deliberately incomplete history, we perpetuate ignorance and prejudice. Today, in this room, we have a choice: continue the lies or embrace the full, rich, complex truth of human achievement." He gathered his papers and walked back to his seat. As he passed Harrington, he paused. "Professor," he said, quietly, but loud enough for the microphones to pick up, "I've left copies of all these sources with your department. I hope you'll find time to read them." The aftermath was swift and decisive. Within hours, videos of Traore's response flooded social media with titles like "African President Destroys Racist Oxford Professor" and "The Most Epic Takedown in Academic History." By the next morning, the videos had garnered millions of views. News outlets around the world picked up the story, and scholars from various African universities provided additional examples, fiercely supporting Traore's meticulously researched points. The hashtag #AfricaBuiltCivilization began trending globally. Professor Harrington, facing an undeniable torrent of public and academic condemnation, released a statement the following day announcing his early retirement to pursue personal interests. Oxford University issued a formal apology and announced a comprehensive review of its history curriculum. The Sheldonian Theatre, where the confrontation had taken place, would now host a new annual lecture series on African contributions to global civilization. The first speaker, of course, would be Ibrahim Traore. But perhaps the most significant outcome came from the students. Enrollment in African studies programs surged across British universities. Young historians, inspired by Traore's courage and clarity, began traveling to Africa to study in archives that had been ignored for centuries. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, the astronomical knowledge of the Dogon people, the medical practices of traditional healers, all became subjects of serious academic study, no longer dismissed as primitive folklore. A year later, Oxford University unveiled a new statue in its main quadrangle. It wasn't of Ibrahim Traore, who had humbly declined the honor. Instead, it was of Ahmed Baba al-Timbukti, the 16th century African scholar whose 1,600 books on law, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics had educated generations while Oxford was still in its infancy. The inscription read, "Knowledge has no color, wisdom has no continent, and truth belongs to all humanity." In an interview years later, Traore reflected on that day at Oxford. "I didn't go there intending to give that speech," he admitted, his voice still calm, thoughtful. "But when Professor Harrington made his statement, I thought of all the African children who would hear such words and believe them. I thought of all the brilliant African minds throughout history whose contributions were erased or stolen. I could not remain silent. The real tragedy," he continued, "is not what one ignorant professor said. It's that his views were considered acceptable in an institution dedicated to truth and knowledge. How many students had sat through his lectures for 47 years absorbing these lies? How many went on to positions of power carrying these prejudices with them? That's why I had to speak, not to humiliate him, but to break the cycle." The interviewer asked if he felt his response was too harsh. Traore shook his head. "For centuries, African history has been written by those who enslaved us, colonized us, and exploited us. They had no interest in acknowledging our achievements. When you've been denied your history for so long, speaking the truth isn't harsh, it's necessary. Professor Harrington had 47 years to learn the truth. He chose ignorance. I simply chose not to let that ignorance stand unchallenged." Today, the Traore moment, as it came to be known, is studied in universities worldwide as a turning point in academic discourse about African history. It serves as a potent reminder that knowledge, real knowledge, requires humility, curiosity, and a willingness to challenge long-held assumptions. It proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against prejudice isn't anger or violence, it's truth, delivered with dignity and backed by irrefutable facts. And in classrooms from Lagos to London, from Cairo to Cape Town, teachers now begin their lessons on African history with a simple truth that should never have been controversial. Africa is not just part of human civilization, it's where human civilization began. The silence that fell over Oxford University that March afternoon wasn't just the end of one professor's career. It was the beginning of a long-overdue conversation about whose stories get told, whose achievements get recognized, and whose contributions to human civilization get remembered. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a truly pivotal moment in academic history. If this story resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of truth to challenge entrenched narratives, please consider liking this chapter, sharing it with others who might benefit from its message, and leaving a comment below with your thoughts. Your engagement helps us continue to bring impactful stories of human achievement to the forefront. And for more content that explores the rich tapestry of global history, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update.